Welcome to Climate Change and Social Change. I'm Wilson Dickinson. In this third presentation, I want to consider the roles and relationships, or the who, of climate change and social change. Understanding these different relationships and roles can bring to clarity our work and efforts. Now, despite the fact that climate change is, by definition, a planetary and collective threat, the liberal and American traditions of individualism still too often frame mainstream approaches to the problem. That is, we approach the problem as individuals rather than as collectives or members of movements. The exemplar that is held up is often the off-grid hero who has found a separate peace by living self-sufficiently. Or the actions that we focus on are our individual consumer choices. Or even in efforts to get political, the focus is on individual voters and their choices at election time. Now, in all these instances, the focus on the individual obscures the importance of structures of power and the forms of everyday life and community. So lost in the courage of the off-grid hero is the impossibility of everyone, or even most people, following her path. Taken for granted in our fretting over buying organic products in the supermarket are the structures of the supermarket itself. Missing from our attention to individual voters are other forms of collective action and the structures that shape electoral processes. Now, focusing on individual action is actually a very effective way to shut down critique, solidarity, and collective action. Now, in critical work on the structures of neoliberalism, this is called responsibilization. So in the neoliberal workplace, assessment is often used so that people become focused on their own individual behavior and performance. So long as people are made to feel that responsibility ultimately lies in their action, then they are less apt to question the factors that might be contributing to their failure. For the individual that is made to feel responsible, problems are rooted in one's own performance, not in the mounting workload, the dysfunctional work culture, or in failing systems. Or so long as the individual feels successful, then the problems are the failures of other individuals. And so when we approach an inherently collective problem, like climate change, and focus on individual choices, we end up being immobilized by guilt, self-blame, cynicism, and apathy. So as ecology is by definition the study of relationships, we should approach our ecological crisis by giving our attention to the relationships and roles that mark our shared lives. The task is to cultivate relationships that build power, and through this collective power, we can push back against structures of power and make a different way of life possible. Our goal should not be to change another individual's mind, but to find ways to change our lives together. So for example, the individual that holds herself responsible to bring her own plate to the church potluck that is serving food on disposable plates is going to become exhausted and alienated. The move is not to try to get everyone to individually choose to bring a plate that can be washed, but to change the culture of the potluck itself. Perhaps using plates that can be washed opens the possibility that a group can bond as they do the dishes together. This move is not just to swim against the strong current of social norms by yourself, but to find social energy to begin to dismantle norms that are at the root of using the disposable plates, like the norms of convenience, or the norm which holds labors of care in disdain. So the focus on individual choice beats its head against the wall of structures of power, daily habits, and social norms. By contrast, the cultivation of relationships builds capacity for cultural and communal change. Now, while the latter is not easy and it takes time, but this is where our energy should go, in building relational power that can grow into collective power. So we've been trained to pay attention to individuals, so it's vital that we come to place relationships at the forefront and to understand the ways that our different roles can fit together. As we need to change the structures of power that are at the root of climate change, and which are great obstacles to collective change, we will need to build coalitions of people power to counter money power. To do this, we'll need to think in terms of both the coalition of the present and the coalitions of the future. And if what we need and want is change, we will need to find concrete and relational ways to ground ourselves in the coalitions of the present and the future. But before we can even begin to think about these dynamics of coalition building, I first feel compelled to counter the conventional, centrist wisdom about political coalition building. So for the last several decades, one of the ruling narratives has been that if people on the left want to win elections, then they must reach out to and build coalitions with those who are independents in the middle. While this narrative is no longer even grounded in the reality of demographics, which we'll cover in a second, I think that it remains powerful because of the assumptions that underlie it. At the heart of this centrist narrative of third-way coalition building is that our real problems are divisions that are creating instability. Centrists see the problem not as being deep systemic dysfunction and material injustice, but they see the problem as being simply a rift that is producing conflict. And the conflict simply needs to be managed. To get to the reasoned place of stability, according to this story, we first need to dialogue with the other side so that we can come to a reasoned agreement. The coalition then is built around a mature middle. The problems and conflict are then managed by handing them over to reasonable experts and elites. So among the many problems with this approach is that it is fundamentally in denial about the nature of the problems that we face. The problems on this account are, again, not about systemic injustice, dysfunction, and unsustainability. They're simply that people do not get along or act with civility. The allure of this approach is that it does not demand any more change than simply a shift in our attitudes. As such, this form of coalition building is fundamentally against systemic change. Its solution is to preserve the system as it is by reestablishing a polite status quo. Now, the coalition of the present is already different from this centrist line. As one study found in 2016, the mythic swing or floating voter now only makes up around 5% of the population. The large voting blocks that decide elections are what are called surge or non-repeat voters, who do not vote in every election but can be mobilized, which are about 20% of the population, and people who are disengaged from the process, which make up about another 20%. So these truly enormous voting blocks, which are together 8 times the size of swing voters, are where coalitions can be built. They're largely composed of young people, communities of color, and low-income people. These are not groups that are currently benefiting from maintaining the status quo. Building a winning coalition, even in the short term, seems to go hand in hand with working for change and justice. Though admittedly, there is still plenty of work to be done here to build trust with disenfranchised groups and to bring along conflict and change-averse moderates and liberals that make up the Democratic establishment. But even in thinking about the coalition of the present, we cannot get stuck in the details of winning the next election. The task is not to find a short-term lowest common denominator self-interest that tries to act within the system as it is. We need to find higher common purposes that inspire courageous action. The coalition then does not need to begin in sameness. Rather, it should work across lines of difference on issues of shared purpose. We don't have to be in total agreement to do so. Rather, we need to be open to the ways that these forms of collaboration and coalition will change us. Through democratic cooperation and participation, we can act, learn from these actions, adapt, improvise, and change dynamically. The change and the work are not predetermined and managed, they are creative. We learn from them. They inform other parts of our lives and are informed by other parts of our lives. So in these ways, the coalitions of today can actively shape the coalitions of the future. But These forms of political and collective action are far too sporadic and are wildly in tension with the structures that shape our daily lives and communities. Therefore, we will need to constantly ground our work in local relationship. As I've already noted, the centrist narratives about problems being rooted fundamentally in division often draws our attention to trying to change the mind of those who are diametrically opposed to us. See, for example, the obsession with climate skeptics. But coalition building instead begins with working to create community that will sustain us, and into which we can invite others. Again, the goal is not changing minds and consumer choices of individuals, but to change our shared lives. We might think of coalition building through a series of concentric circles. So this form of coalition building demands that we ground ourselves deeply in communities that share our values, and that, depending on our location, our gifts, and our relationships, that we work across a number of lines to build the coalition over time. So at the center of the long work of coalition building, here represented in kind of light brown, is cultivating local integrated community. That is, the reaching out to others who already acknowledge the scope of the problem and who are seeking ways to realize change in their lives. Building this relational capacity is central to sustaining the urgent work of now and for building coalitions that will shape the future. We all need to be grounded in some kind of local, communal work where we can begin to incarnate ways of integrity, justice, and joy. Even if these efforts only touch part of our lives, they can serve to ground us, to sustain us, to deepen our understanding, and they will begin to provide a space into which we can invite others. In addition to this central work, we need to build networks among local efforts. So we need to form alliances with others who are doing similar work. This will need to take place across lines of difference in terms of race and class, both to build a broader base and to inform and transform our work. For people of privilege and for white communities, it will be especially important to connect with and learn from marginalized groups and communities of color, as these communities have intergenerational wisdom to share on how to struggle against systems, and learning from their perspective will serve as a corrective to the ways that dominant systems of power have deformed our intuitions. Furthermore, we'll need to build relationships with natural allies in other places to expand our imagination and cultivate our moral courage. So these connections are, in a sense, the low-hanging fruit of coalition building at the center of these circles. But it's also necessary to engage in the longer-term work within established groups and institutions for transformation. These are communities or organizations where there is some resonance, perhaps even just a sliver of resonance with issues of justice and sustainability, but there are still significant obstacles to action. This might be the church that is a little comfortable with justice language, but which is populated with professionals who cannot currently see beyond the status quo. Or it might be the university, where social justice has some currency, but issues of climate justice are not on people's radar. So much of the work in these spaces is about educating and organizing those who are still in denial about the reality and most especially implications of the problems that we face. If local communities are the heart of the coalition, and growing networks are the next layer out, then this work with institutions, organizations, and communities is the expanding outer layer of the coalition that works to bring people in. While it seems vital that everyone is grounded to some degree in a local community, the different social location, points of access, and gifts will change the emphasis in this work of coalition building for different folks. That is, on this diagram, I propose that everyone needs one foot firmly planted in cultivating local community, but they can also have another foot in another sphere of influence. Some people might be more natural bridge builders between emergent and centrally committed groups, while others might have long-standing relationships or even leadership roles within organizations or institutions that still need to undergo a great deal of change. Part of discerning where your work is located in building coalitions is thinking about the communities to which you have access and the relationships that you already have. Right, so another part of discerning where our efforts of coalition building should be guided by the limits and gifts of our places, our immediate and social relationships, and in ourselves and bodies. I've spent a good deal of time and wasted energy fighting against the limits of my place and my personality because my vision of the work of change was too small and too uniform. While part of these efforts are inherent to the work of change, which is constantly discerning what is currently appropriate and which is struggling against assumptions and norms, having a broader vision of how a movement can be supported by a vast array of work and relationships frees us up to do the work that is appropriate for our time and place. So working to build coalitions is not the same as seeking universal consensus. And so in the short and midterm, we will not need everyone. And oftentimes, centrist calls for unity will actually undermine building a coalition because they will distract from the problems. Again, making it seem as though the issue is division rather than systemic unsustainability and injustice. But having said this, part of the important work of coalition building is maintaining relationships even with those who are diametrically opposed to change. Now, I don't see this as being a central task for everyone, but for those whose lives are caught in between, the maintenance of relationships of decency, care, and understanding is still vital. We need to distinguish between the liars and those who have been lied to, between the bosses and those caught up in the culture-wide Stockholm Syndrome. And so, there are a lot of people who might be a part of the coalition one day who appear to be adversaries now. But even for those who remain opposed to the work of justice and sustainability in the long term, we want and need everyone to be a part of the beloved community. And in the short term, there is actually a profound value in pacifying those who feel threatened and are becoming increasingly destructive. And so while the proverbial reaching across the aisle is not the primary or even secondary task, it is still deeply needed. In addition to thinking about the complex layers and timelines of coalition building, I think that it's also helpful to think about the different kinds of central roles that are needed for leaders in the movement. So Paul Light provides a heuristic typology of different agents of social change that is helpful here. He lists 4 different but complementary roles in social change movements. They're social entrepreneurs, social safekeepers, social advocates, and social explorers. Now for the first, social entrepreneurs, these are people who create new organizations that address local problems. Social entrepreneur is a person who creates a nonprofit to establish a community garden in a food desert, or who finds a way to repurpose a church building to set up a clinic or co-working space, or comes up with a different kind of new church start. Now, framing these roles in terms of entrepreneurship comes with all kinds of profound problems, which we don't have time to unpack here. But in addition to social entrepreneurs, I think we need to think about social artists, social craftsmen and craftswomen, and social organizers. These are folks who are shaping social experiments that might be less centered on immediately solving problems and more on captivating the imagination. Others create structures that cannot be scaled up and mass-produced, but which take care, skill, and participate in the genius of a place. Others will shape organizations that do not have central leadership, but that hold a space that might make things possible. So this work of social entrepreneurship, or even better, organizing, allows us to see the viability of alternatives, and it creates social connections and social infrastructure that allow communities to begin to establish connections, to build people power, and to see the viability of alternatives. Now, social entrepreneurs and artists need to be complemented by a number of other agents. So social safekeepers or social caretakers work within established institutions to protect the gains of the past. It's also often the case that community and system changing programs and solutions often come from within existing institutions and from collaborative teams. So the social caretaker might be the minister of an established church, or the administrator of a college, or the teacher of a school, or the director of a community center, or the manager of a long-standing co-op. So in addition to social organizers and social caretakers are the figures that we most often associate with the central work of social justice, social advocates. Right? These are people who work to bring about policy and systemic change in the centers of power. Social advocates might be those who mobilize popular protests at the Capitol building, or who organize a lobbying effort, or who place pressure on boards of powerful institutions. Yet, as we have already noted in a previous presentation, while the work of advocates is central, this type of grassroots work is impossible if the grass has no roots. That is, if there are no social organizers or caretakers shaping the communities that will provide people power. Conversely, social organizers and caretakers will find themselves always swimming upstream against an exhausting force if they do not push for systemic change. Now finally, there's also an important role to be played here by those who are doing research and visioning work to see the big picture and to look ahead. Paulite calls these social explorers. Social explorers are inherently irritating as they interrogate the underlying values, efficacy, and sustainability of contemporary efforts, as they point toward changes that are coming and shifts in vision and imagination that might allow the movement to meet these challenges. Now, these different roles need to work together. Doing so serves to correct the shortcoming of their respective spheres of influence, as, for example, caretakers might simply work to preserve the status quo, or might feel trapped by long-standing norms if members of their communities are not involved in other efforts, or if there are not viable alternatives to point to, or if structures of power constantly push them in one direction. So, seeing these various roles, like seeing the different work of building coalitions, is important because it allows us to acknowledge the work of others and to figure out what our small sustaining role can be. If we think that we have to be doing all of the work with all of the people all of the time, we'll never get started, or if we do, we'll burn out. So the church and religious communities can be involved in all levels of this work of coalition building, and in the different roles of social change leadership. So our individualistic take on the gospel often obscures this, but this is precisely the kind of work that Jesus Christ and early Christian communities were engaged in. Jesus was an organizer who unveiled structures of power and who initiated local practices in communities to build an alternative kingdom. He transformed food economies by calling and organizing fishermen and farmers. He built coalitions between the people of the land, peasants, tax collectors, the poor, the injured, the marginalized. And we too often miss this because we see Christ's work as trying to include an excluded individual. But his work was not including the marginalized into the status quo, but of building a coalition that could renew the covenant and change the world. Following the path of Christ, the church can play a central role in the work that's at the heart of coalition building, fostering social change. Like the ministry of Christ, the church can bring people together around alternative, joyful, and just practices. This might mean that the church is organized in alternative ways, being centered around a farm or garden, or placed in people's homes around a meal. Or this could mean that established congregations begin to transform their long-standing practices to help shape communities that support lives of integrity, justice, and joy. Or established congregations or simply old church buildings might become spaces of connection between groups. They might house efforts and initiatives that seek to create new economies or which are simply trying to repair and heal the bonds of our local communities. Yet many established churches are not yet prepared to become these places of integrity or connection. They are made up of those who are in denial, especially those who are in denial about the implications of climate change. This makes them a space that is ripe for the long-term work of educating and organizing to bring about conversion and to expand the coalition. And we should remember that the work here is not to change the minds of individuals, but to change our shared lives. And so in these established churches and institutions, the work is to appeal to the practices, the moral imaginations and stories, and the dangerous memory of Christian traditions, to begin to build relationships in places where people can be invited into something that is beautiful and life-giving. In this moment, I think that it is important to say that the primary work of the church is not to bring people together across the aisle. If we allow the centrist vision of unity to guide our work, issues of climate, justice, and social change will be silenced and tabled rather than made central. We need to be focusing more on building spaces that we can invite people into. But if this is inherent to the place where we are, and we have the relationships and personal gifts to build community with people who are diametrically opposed to change, this can also be important work. Christians are people of conversion and repentance. We're a movement largely shaped by someone like Paul, who was once an enemy but became the greatest advocate. So we need to be open to the possibility that the people we least expect can join the coalition. Furthermore, there is a value to pacifying people who feel threatened and who are getting increasingly violent. But again, this is not likely the primary work, but is dependent upon one's location and gifts. Finally, religious communities can, depending on their composition and their placement, play a crucial role in the roles of social change. They must remember, however, that local efforts cannot be divorced from systemic advocacy, and that advocacy must be rooted in deep and integral communities, and that established communities need to be guided by those who are showing us a path forward in the concrete viability of change. Climate change is a problem that requires building a coalition, and it demands people and initiatives that are working on various levels and in different ways. In seeing these connections, we can better coordinate our work and live into the particularities of our places. The work is not to change the minds of individuals or the choices of consumers, but to transform our shared lives so that they can be beautiful, joyful, and just.